Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I'm Kate Dickerson. Today's episode is a conversation I had with Aaron Weiskittel, a professor of forest biometrics and modeling at the University of Maine. Aaron and I have known each other for over a decade, and his work and research is one of the best examples I know of to help us understand how being a forester today is far different than what most of us probably imagine when we think of forestry. I really enjoyed talking to Aaron and hearing about his work, and I hope you enjoy our conversation as well. Today's episode of the Maine Science Podcast is brought to you by Bangor Savings Bank, committed to supporting scientific exploration and discovery in Maine. Aaron, welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. You and I have known each other for longer than I'd like to admit sometimes, I think, because you came into the University of Maine while I was still there at the Smith Center working on the FBRI project. So our time overlapped a little bit. And you came in, it was my chance to start learning about forestry and forest stuff in Maine, which was really cool and I know hugely important to the state. So now that we've let everybody know that this is going to be a conversation about forests, I thought it would be good to kind of hear about how did you get into forestry? I know that you went to, I can't believe I have to say it like this, but the Ohio State University, which while it might be a great forestry school, is not necessarily in the middle of forests. So did you grow up in the Midwest? Did you grow up somewhere else? If you can give us a little bit about your path, that would be great.
Yeah. Thanks, Kate, for having me. I'm very excited to be here. It was great that we overlapped and we shared some time together on the Forest Bioproducts Research Initiative, which was an exciting endeavor for Maine. So my path to forestry is not a linear one and was kind of a fun way to get there. I did grow up in the Midwest, which probably has more corn than forest, but fortunately I had parents who enjoyed the outdoors and took every advantage to visit national parks and national forest in our summer vacations. So I spent a lot of time working and hiking and being outdoors, which I really enjoyed and appreciated. I did go to the Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio, a school of over 50,000 individuals. But amazingly, they don't have an ecology program. So I actually ended up in forestry just by chance. I was interested in ecology and community ecology specifically, but I didn't really want to do zoology or any other ologies. So I went across the river and ended up in the natural research department and forestry specifically. And there I really found a passion because it's kind of this nice combination of both art and science. That's how forestry is often described, as the art and science of managing trees. So really I was able to put together two things of both kind of a scientific inquiry, but also an applied aspect of science, which I come to really appreciate in forest. So after spending time in the Midwest, which do have beautiful forests, they were once one of the highest wood suppliers for the U.S. at the turn of the century. Lots of oaks and beautiful sugar maples and beech. So very much a hardwood-dominated forest like southern Maine. And then I headed west out to Oregon State to work on kind of more conifer-dominated systems in the beautiful Pacific Ocean.
Before I make you talk about your research, I'm just curious, did you have a favorite national park growing up? What an extraordinary opportunity to kind of be introduced to the world in general, but also kind of the treasures that we have as a country.
Yeah, obviously we didn't hit them all, unfortunately, but the ones that really stuck out in my mind were up in the Great Lakes around Lake Superior, some really beautiful sand dunes and forest. So those really stuck out to me. And then after I moved west, I got to see some of the more infamous national parks like Yosemite, Olympic National Park in Washington. So those clearly are top of my list, but obviously being a tree guy, I have to go with Redwood National Park, which I think is one of not as well known and a relatively undervisited park, particularly in California. But there's just an incredible set of trees there and a very not extensive national park, but just quite spectacular as it goes from coast to mountains in a very short spatial distance.
That one is beautiful. I feel like we almost happened upon it. Many years ago, my husband and I had a quick trip to California and we kind of looked at a map and we're like, oh, let's go there. So it's truly awe-inspiring.
Yeah, there's two groves there, the Lady Bird Johnson Grove and I guess you could say it, the formerly tallest tree in the world grove. Definitely both are off the highway and off the beaten path, but quite spectacular and just showcase the beauty and just awe-inspiring of large trees like that.
So Oregon, you said you went to study about conifers. So this might be a good time to re-educate me and anybody who's listening, the difference between trees and what it is you were studying in Oregon.
Yep. So Oregon State which tends is the beavers and not the ducks. So it's well known, long history of a forestry school. The West, so the way to kind of break this up is the West tends to be more dominated by what we would consider conifers or cone-bearing trees. These are often associated with being evergreened or kind of don't lose their needles over the year, more needle-bearing trees. It's just because they tend to tolerate drier summers better and are more adapted to fire, which tends to occur more out in the West. The alternative is hardwoods or non-cone bearing trees, which tend to be kind of the maples, the beech, the birch, just deciduous trees that tend to lose their foliage during the off season. These tend to require more moisture and are less adapted to fire, just more moderate disturbances like we have here in the eastern US. So yeah, Western, more conifer dominated, drier systems. I was studying at Oregon kind of Douglas fir, which is probably the most well-known conifer species, named for the great Scottish botanist, David Douglas, who spent a lot of time out in the Western North America and discovered Douglas fir, or at least named it. Very tall, large growing species, used a lot for commercial purposes, a lot for export markets, a lot goes to Asia just because of the high quality, but used a lot domestically. So obviously there's a large industry centered around Douglas fir and has been for 200 plus years. So I was studying a disease that affected Douglas fir and its growth, which really had a large impact over the last 10, 15 years. A lot of it in the coastal areas. So Douglas fir kind of habits a very narrow belt, tends to like a lot of moisture and not too warm a temperatures. So it generally grows on the west side of the Cascade Mountains that occur throughout the Pacific Northwest. In the Northwest, also, when it's commercially managed, it tends to be managed in plantations. So the trees are planted, grown for 50 to 60 years, and the cycle is started over again. So very different than the type of management we see here in Maine, but very productive, highly valued, and lots of different end uses. So I did both my master's and PhD out there, kind of looking at the impacts of the foliar disease, what happens when a tree loses half its foliage. The quick answer is it grows half as fast as it should. And then the other part of that was studying the productivity, because you can go from a very wet set of conditions when you're close to the coast to very dry conditions. And so potentially looking at the impacts of climate change and soil moisture on tree growth, just kind of the basic physiology.
So it sounds like that second part has been a continuation of your research then here, since we don't really have Douglas firs, but we do have different species of conifers. And the thing I learned at the festival this year, so the Science Festival, you were part of a panel that talked about the science and all the different ways that forestry happens in Maine, in which people, I think, probably don't quite recognize everything, from the data science to the products. And I did not realize that Maine is this place where southern type forest and northern type forest cross. And I think I'm saying that correctly. So it sounds like some of your work with the Douglas fir and how it's impacted by the environment is applicable from the perspective of understanding the research. But it also sounds like here you have a much larger research that you could look at, whether it's conifer or hardwood. And I will stop there and see if you can let me know what I got right and wrong there.
Yeah, Maine is unique in a lot of respects, just given the dependence and the long history of the forest in our rural communities. We're the white pine state. We're one of the few states with a tree on the license plate. I think Oregon might be the only other state. But yeah, you're right. There's lots of softwoods or conifers here in Maine, and they're some of our classic species: spruce, fir, white pine. But we also have a dominance of a lot of hardwoods, just like right now it's sugar maple season, and that's a big part of our cultural history. There's paper birch, yellow birch, red maple, American beech, tons of hardwoods. But you're exactly right. Where Maine sits geographically at about the 45th latitude is kind of a transitional zone ecologically as we go from the southern temperate forest from the Appalachians. These tend to be more hardwood dominated mesic species that like rich and long growing seasons, to more of the conifer dominated boreal species, which tend to be the spruce, fir. And those generally become more dominant as you go further north, as you get into kind of the cold and short growing seasons of northern Canada. So yeah, right around Bangor, we kind of see this intermingling of species from the south and intermingling of species from the north. So we often say that climate change could have pretty dramatic effects here because you have many species that are either at their northern limit or at their southern limit. And so they're obviously stretched. So small changes in terms of just the typical environmental conditions could have large implications. And that's a lot of what our research has been focused on. One of my specialties for science or my expertise is in forecasting future forests. So that is one thing that's unique about forest is having to think about long-term changes. So a typical kind of time frame for us is generally on the order of magnitude of 50 to 100 years. A lot of what we think about is what do you do today and how does that impact what the forest might look like 50 to 100 years in the future. And so you got to understand the tree's basic biology, what are the driving conditions, whether it be soil or climate, and how do they interact with potential management strategies, and then combining all that into kind of some projections of what the future forest, both in terms of species composition, but also in terms of structure might look like.
So that seems like a really long time frame in the context of how changes with the climate are happening. I would say kind of on the downward slope of a roller coaster at this point, but also with that as part of it, things like different pest invasions that can devastate a forest much faster than a 50-year time frame or a 100-year time frame. So how do you take that into account when you're trying to forecast good management practices?
No, it's really hard. I mean, most predictions are wrong, even if in the short term. We always like to complain about the weather forecast and how they get things wrong. But yeah, it's even harder to think about things on a decade or century basis. So that's what makes it interesting is you kind of got to go back to first principles and think about kind of the basic biology and what trees are responsive to. And another important aspect is mapping out alternative scenarios. So just like we can't really forecast the weather, which has gotten surprisingly good in the recent decades. So a lot of that just deals with availability of data and understanding the current conditions. And so I think that's a lot of where we lean on technology in forestry. Obviously, there's 17 million acres of forest, and you're not going to go out and sample every tree every year to kind of see how it's faring. And so we have to use kind of this integrated network of ground-based measurements that happen throughout Maine and then link them back to some type of aerial product, whether they be aerial imagery or remote sensing that we get from satellites. So if we do that on a fairly regular basis, we can stitch together basically how the forest is faring on an annual basis. We can look at disturbances and where they're happening. And we can also look at shifts in both species composition as well as growth. So right now we're about 40, 50 years post the last major spruce budworm outbreak in Maine. Many of our trees are 50, 60 years old, and they're kind of at their peak growth, their peak sequestration rates. And so that's a big question right now on our mind is the forest is offsetting well over 75% of the state's emissions. It's a little bit higher in the most recent cycle. And is this sustainable as we go forward, particularly given the potential impacts of climate change or even another spruce budworm outbreak? And so we keep a close eye on the forest. And the positive thing with forests is that you can be proactive and we know how to manage the forest so that we can make the trees more resilient. We can favor one species over another. We can do more adaptive management techniques like planting certain species. So I think that's the goal, is to give foresters a suite of tools that they can go out and really try to make the best decisions on every acre of forest.
This is a ignorance on my part, but the forests that were decimated by this spruce bedworm, what happens to those trees that have to be cut down? Can they be used for anything, or are they so damaged that they can't be used? And I'm wondering what you've seen with the emerald ash borer. Is it the same kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. So most of the spruce fir that was killed during the last spruce budworm outbreak was actually utilized. They went in and did either pre or post salvage harvesting. So if a tree dies, you can still go in and harvest it like you would a living tree. You do have to be relatively quick because the trees start to deteriorate and lose quality quickly. So I think most of that goes for long-term uses. Most spruce and fir is used for structural timbers, a lot of what we call studwood, which goes by 2x4s basically. So a lot of that ends up in residential applications, whether it be homes or other kind of long-lived applications. And that is a big part of Maine's carbon budget. So I kind of quoted 75% of the state's emissions are offset by the forest. 60% of that is just the forest itself, and another 15% is kind of through long-lived products like 2x4s or plywood or other kind of applications of wood. So I think what's important is that it's a renewable resource and that it has lots of different applications, which not only are important, but also I think offset more kind of greenhouse intensive materials like cement or steel. So it's kind of has this double whammy impact. As for emerald ash borer, this is a little more complicated because the trees tend to die over several years, and the beetle actually damages the tissue in the inside of the tree, whereas spruce budworm just causes needle defoliation. And most ash tend to be isolated as well, so they don't tend to grow in large areas. So it's often not economically viable to go in and harvest ash in a lot of places. So if you travel through the Midwest, you'll see just a lot of dead skeleton trees of ash that were left in place. So I don't think the opportunities to salvage the ash are as readable. But I know many of the Native American tribes in Maine are thinking about strategies of either a pre or post salvage as they prepare for the emerald ash borer, just given the cultural importance of brown ash. But each insect is unique and each tree is unique. So that's what makes a lot of this difficult, is working at very large scales to make this kind of ecologically and economically viable for any landowner.
So you and I talked about this before the Science Festival, and one of the reasons we wanted to do a session was to try to help folks better understand what it looks like to do forestry nowadays in Maine. And you mentioned aerial surveys and photos and things like that. I would love for you to explain that a little bit more, but before you do, how have the tools of your research changed from when you first started to now? Has technology helped make, I don't want to say easier, has it made maybe the burden of collecting data a little bit easier so that you can get a faster understanding of what's happening in the forest?
Yeah, and we've talked about timescales. So forests are obviously a slow but extensive ecosystem to monitor. Change happens at usually small time steps that we need to pay close attention to. So I think that's where forests are really important, in that the monitoring technology can allow us to look at very high resolution, almost at a tree level across that 17 million acres, which is really quite unfathomable even just 5 or 10 years ago. So just having that level of information and the availability of that information and to be able to do it on a desktop computer of today's technology. I know there's some landowners in Maine that can pull up individual trees on their own phones and just walk to that tree. So I think this rapid evolution of technology is exciting. And I do think the future of a forester looks very different in the short term. I think a lot of our students are somewhat disappointed that we spend almost as much time in front of a computer as other professions. And I think forestry's always been an early adopter of technology, whether it be GPS, the geographic position systems that many of the foresters use out in the woods, GIS, which is geographic information systems that learn about all the kind of spatial data that we have to work with and do our planning process. And I think, as we talked about, this early emergence of remote sensing. Remote sensing has been talked about in forestry since the 70s with some of the early launches of the satellites. And I think it's just today that we're starting to realize some of that vision. There's now things like Planet that you can get a return interval of a few days and very high resolution imagery, which allows you to detect diseases. It's also of a resolution that you can measure individual tree crowns and identify species, rather than these kind of large blobs that have historically been remote sensing. So now that you have the resolution and data, it makes it much more useful. Many of our undergrads get traditional forest measurement kind of backgrounds. They learned how to measure tree or height and diameter and all the statistics that go around with that. But they're also exposed to this kind of new generation of doing things, a lot more on geographic information systems, a lot more on remote sensing, a lot more on using decision support tools within a computerized environment. So I think foresters today have to learn just as much technology as many other professions, which I think is important to think about as we hear about kind of the mill closures and just changes that are happening within the sector broadly.
I want to circle back to what you said in Bangor, where we're at the crux of the two species intersecting. Would you expect that you'll be able to use these higher tech tools to see how, number one, that border area is adapting to climate change, but also to see if maybe both sides of it are getting creamed as opposed to one side. It's not winning, but one side thriving and the other side not thriving as much. Or maybe like the better way to think about it is a line progresses. Is that the type of thing that you'll be able to see at the granular level much faster than you would have otherwise?
Yeah, and we're already seeing that to some degree. Not that one side's winning versus another. What I think is always going to be the case is Maine's forest is mostly mixed, and it'll be mostly mixed as we go forward. It's just going to be a different mixture of what species are present or which ones are more dominant. But yeah, we've already used satellite technology to document changes in the growing season. So we already know that bud break or the start of the growing season happens 7 to 10 days earlier than normal. And also leaf fall is occurring 2 to 3 weeks later in the fall, which extends the growing season. So we've been able to monitor that over the last 2 to 3 decades using remote sensing imagery and kind of have used that to forecast what future changes are going to happen. I think also we've seen a shift in the species composition. As you might expect, Maine's forest used to be predominantly softwood, so pines and spruce and fir were much more extensive. Particularly spruce fir were more boreal or depend on colder winters and cooler growing seasons. And so now we're seeing an expansion of the hardwood species that can tolerate more fluctuations in climate, and in particular, drier summers. But I think that's really been what's remarked or what's really shocked a lot of people is just how dry the last couple summers have been, which really impacts trees. So we've also used a lot of fine scale technology to map the impacts of those droughts. So trees, we've seen a lot more outbreaks of forest pest. Obviously in the Bangor area, it's a lot of brown-tailed moth, but along the coast, you've seen a lot more tent caterpillars or defoliators that really can impact the hardwood species. And those are likely due to some of the conditions in our growing season, but mostly it's related to our warmer winters, which allows species to migrate further north than they have historically been.
Is this basic research, Aaron? I'm assuming the research that you're doing, it's available to the public at large, but you obviously have an audience for it. But you were doing it to figure things out so that multitudes of users could use it. Is that a correct assumption?
Yeah, I think that's, again, let's get back to the other part of our conversation. That's what really attracted me to forestry is it's applied science. So yeah, there's many basic elements of our research of basic knowledge of how trees grow and the climate factors that influence them, but it's taken within a management context. We know that most Maine's forests will be managed one way or another. And so developing the tools and technology to help landowners make decisions is really the primary motivating part of my research. And the fun part of my job is I get to interact with a variety of landowners all the way from kind of small folks that own only 10, 20 acres in their backyards to all the way to people that own more than 1 million acres. I think the fundamental questions remain the same as how are my trees growing and how will they grow into the future? But obviously the scale of the question changes whether you own 10 acres or 1 million acres, which I find is exciting, trying to find that kind of middle ground where there's kind of connections between both the landowners and the fact that they're focused on the future forest, I think is the underlying motivator.
So I think it's really hard to live in Maine and not hear from someone that Maine is the most forested state in the country. But we also have a really interesting culture around private land ownership. And I know in the West, right, the largest landowners, kind of put that in quotes, is the federal government. There's huge swaths of government land. I'm curious what it felt like for you to go from spending time in Oregon in the West, where there were very large landowners, as well as the federal government owning, my understanding is the vast majority of the land, to come here and say, like you said, you could go from talking to someone who's got 1 million acres to someone who's got 10 or 20. Like that is a very different conversation, I would think.
Yeah, no, you're right. Maine is the most forested state in the U.S. at 89% forested. If we got rid of the lakes and streams, we'd be well over 95%. So I'm always shocked every time I get on an airplane just to see the extent of Maine's forest. It's really quite unbelievable. And if you take a look at kind of the night sky or the kind of the images of where light pollution occurs, you see northern Maine and it's a dark spot and that's all trees, which to me is exciting. One of the challenges out west is just this philosophical divide on land tenure and land management. So not only Maine is the most forested state, it's also highly private. In the private, even though we lump it into this private category, it's all the way from very small landowners who have no technical background or even interest to very large, wealthy individuals that own land throughout the US. Whereas out west, it's really just this public-private debate. And you're right, the federal government, particularly the US Forest Service, is a large owner in the Western US. And there's been a lot of challenges over the last 3 decades, just in terms of shifting public attitudes towards forest management. And so a lot of what used to have active management on national forest in the Western US is no longer the case. And so you have a lot of trees that are out there and probably approaching conditions that they'll be dead and dying. And so a lot of that wildfire that we hear about in the news is unfortunately not much of a shock. It's accelerated by climate change, but a lot of it's dealing with management decisions that were made 20 or 30 years ago. And so you just got the buildup of fuels, and it just takes a few dry years or climate change to accelerate the start of a wildfire. But really what carries a wildfire is the extent and the availability of fuels. And so, yeah, it's a big debate about who should own the land, what should the management objectives be, and how should the public have access to that land. So I think, yeah, it's really rewarding to come to Maine, mostly private, but I think forestry is an accepted practice here and people view it in the benefits. A big shocker of coming from the West is just private gates kind of blocking access to land. This can even happen in our national forests just because of the controversial of logging and forest management activities. So here you have very few gates, and even though it's private land, it's kind of publicly available, which to me I think is really rewarding because you can talk to people about forestry and the benefits that it brings to the landscape.
So how do you see, I'm going to make you do a little bit of projection, even though I didn't warn you I was going to do this. How do you see the next 5 to 10 to 15 years for Maine's forests? Do you think there'll be any resolution on where that border of southern and northern is coming from? Do you think we'll have figured out how to address the emerald ash borer so it doesn't decimate all the ash? Or, I mean, just throwing out the things I've heard of, but I'm happy to hear your expertise on this.
Yeah, no, I think it's a hard one. I mean, I think this is where your expertise is almost as valid as mine. It's really hard to make these forecasts. I think we can make a few informed guesses, but I think the rewarding thing is ultimately the future of our forests is shaped by us. And I think that's very different than a lot of other ecosystems that really are on their own trajectory. And no matter what we do, we're not going to change them. But I feel positive about the forest. So I don't think the story for ash is a good one. There might be pockets up north that are protected and the ash borer doesn't get to it. It's really going to depend on the severity of our winters, which obviously continue just to become more and more mild. I do think that forests will remain forests, so that is a big benefit to us, is that this whole land conversion that happened over the turn of the century is going to continue and forests will remain forest. I don't know about the shifting species. I think spruce has a challenging future ahead just because of the warming climate. But a lot of the recent studies have shown red spruce to be growing exceptionally well, which is not what we expected. So I think there's going to be plenty of surprises and things that we totally didn't expect to happen. I do think the one that I'm most excited about is just the change in renewable products and the interest in green products, so I really think it's the intersection of forest and the renewable products that they generate. So I think there's so many uses that trees can lend themselves to. And I think it's just addressing this mindset of being in a decarbonized world that's less dependent on fossil fuels. And I think that that's going to involve renewable resources like trees in one way or another. So to me, that's what I'm trying to kind of put forth, is that forestry has a future. And if you're really interested in the environment and addressing the negative impacts of climate change, I would encourage people to think about forestry and the opportunities that the profession has.
I really am encouraged by you reminding me that not all human insight leads to destruction, that we really can make things better. One of the things that we're trying to figure out how to do is talk about success stories. And I think forestry certainly has plenty of those. I have one last question for you. And I apologize if you don't think it's fair, but I had the opportunity, I think probably 2 years ago, to talk to Tom Clack, who's working on the American chestnut genetic program. And they did just suffer a setback recently. But I'm curious if things like that, and I know it's not your field, but do things like that inspire you, or do you think it's futile, or do you think it's just another way to find out how trees work?
No, I think it's a positive. I mean, the American chestnut was a prized species for a long time, and it dominated forest all the way throughout the eastern seaboard. And just the extent of the change that almost in 100 years, now you can hardly find a chestnut in the area that it once thrived. So there's a lot of cool science and technology that's gone into revitalizing the chestnut tree. And I think that deals with very advanced stuff like genetics and gene splicing and all kinds of neat ideas. To me, that's great that people are that passionate about an individual species and are willing to bring it back and try to restore it on a landscape. So I think there are plenty of positive case examples like that. And I know that the chestnut orchard here up in Orono has done quite well in recent years, and trees are getting beyond the threshold where they usually get impacted by the blight. I just point out that we have a whole landscape of these species. Maine, again, is 17 million acres of forest. So it's going to be really hard to pick winners and losers as we go forward. But I think if we can keep options on the table and think about whether it be chestnut or white oak or white pine or other species that might be players, to keep our minds open and options flexible as we kind of move through difficult times. I think you're right, though, that there are some success stories. I do think we have to be positive and think about it. I'm reassured by some of this interest in natural climate solutions. So how can we use our natural environment to address climate change? Yeah, we can build big vacuums that suck CO2 out of the atmosphere and bury it way down deep. But ultimately, that's very expensive technology, and it almost takes just as much energy to capture the CO2 as you offset. So for me, it's finding low cost, extensive things. And usually that's where forests kind of put themselves is, can we better manage the forest? Can we do certain practices to increase sequestration? Can we push it towards along the project products that offset our typical fossil fuel products? So I think it's getting creative and keeping all options on the table at this point.
Well, I think the work that you're doing to help us even understand and catalog what is on those 17 million acres is pretty extraordinary and a foundation that we need so that we can do the cool, inspired by nature solutions that I actually really think and truly believe are not only possible, but critical to help us get there. So I really appreciate your work. I love talking to you, Aaron. I feel like there's about a million more things we could have gone into, but no one's going to listen to that long of a podcast episode. So we're not going to torment people with that. Like I said, I really appreciate your work. I hope the rest of the semester goes well, and I cannot wait to see your next steps.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to be here. And yeah, if people really are interested, they can find me at the University of Maine. And I really encourage people, whether it's just hiking in your local nature preserve or traveling up to the Great Maine North Woods, it's really an exciting time to be part of the forest renewable resource and think about the bright future that forests might have.
Thanks for listening to the Maine Science Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on your podcast platform of choice. And please leave a rating and review. It will help more people find us and help spread the word about some of the remarkable people doing science in Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is recorded at Discovery Studios at the Maine Discovery Museum in Bangor, Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is executive produced and hosted by me, Kate Dickerson, and edited and produced by Scott Loiselle. The Discover Maine theme was composed and performed by Nick Parker.